Hey everybody, this is Kelly of Rojo Chief Clothing, and as you see right here, this is my Instagram, and I'm going to click on my link tree. That's going to send you to all of my links: Anchor.fm, the YouTube channel that you already know about, my online clothing store, and my Facebook page, so you can follow me. Alright, so Anchor.fm, that's my podcast. So stories or news that I'm not going to post on YouTube, you can find them on my podcast, and you can listen to them on Spotify and also on Breaker and other, podcasts. Okay. Then, as you may or may not know, this is my online clothing store where you can find fashions on here for men, women, kids, and babies. So, let's get ready for the show. Hey everybody, this is Kelly of Rojo Chief Clothing, and here, this is a video about, it says Kurimeo, it's about Kurimeo, by Paris McGee Bay Jr. It says Freemasons Challenge, Kurimeo, Awu, spot on, all Masons. Okay, now, when I play this, you're going to see Kurimeo right here to the left. He's going to be doing some sort of Masonic hand gestures. See? So right there with his hands, he's doing something. He's doing some sort of Masonic symbolism right there. And as you know, Masonry is based off of esoteric meanings, and the esoteric is tied into the metaphysical world as well as spiritual teachings. Okay? So it's a lot of symbolism behind the Masonic hand gestures and what they mean. And inside of the Mason or Masonic lodges, they learn a lot of information about history, about religion, about chemistry, about sacred geometry, etc. So that's why it's hard for me to believe that Kurimeo didn't know about these books that I'm about to present pretty soon. Okay, now it's a book that I knew about years ago. At least I knew about this book for at least, I'll say, about 6 years or so. And it's called The 13th Tribe Paperback, June 1st, 1976, by author Cosettler. I think this man and his wife, there's people that believe that this man had been murdered because of what he said in this book. Okay. Now let's look at it. It says the startling new discovery about the true ancestry of the Jewish people. It will cause a stir. And then let's look at in the back of it what it says. Okay. So basically what it says on the back of this book, it says this book traces the history of the ancient Khazar Empire, a major but almost forgotten power in Eastern Europe, which in the Dark Ages became converted to Judaism. Khazaria was finally, let's see here, wiped out by the forces of Genghis Khan. Now, Genghis Khan, as you know, he was part of the Mongolian Empire. Okay? And it says, but evidence indicates that the Khazars themselves migrated to Poland and formed the cradle of Western Jewry. It says, to the general reader, the Khazars, who flourished from the 7th to the 11th century, might seem indefinitely remote today, yet they have a close and unexpected bearing on our world, which emerges as Mr. Cosettler recounts the fascinating history of the ancient Khazar Empire, a major but almost forgotten power in Eastern Europe, At about the time that Charlemagne the Emperor in the West, the Khazars' sway extended from the Black Sea to the Caspian, from the Caucasus to the Volga, and they were instrumental in stopping the Muslim onslaught against the Byzantium, the eastern jaw of the gigantic pincer movement that the West swept across northern Africa and into Spain. Therefore, the Khazars found themselves in a precarious position between the two major world powers, the Eastern Roman Empire and Byzantium, and the triumphant followers of Muhammad. As Mr. Zetler points out, the Khazars were the third world of their day, and they chose a surprising method of resisting both the Western pressure to become Christian. Let's see here where I leave off at. To become Christian, and the Eastern to adopt Islam. Rejecting both, they converted to Judaism. In the second part of this book, The Heritage, Mr. Kozelier speculates about the ultimate fate of the Khazars and the impact of the racial composition and social heritage of modern Jewry. He produces a large body of meticulously detailed research in support of a theory that sounds all the more convincing for the restraint of which it is advanced. Yet should the theory be confirmed, the term anti-Semitism would become void of meaning. As Mr. Kozler writes, it is based on a misapprehension shared by both the killers and their victims. The story of the Khazar Empire, as it slowly emerges from the past, begins to look like the most cruel hoax which history has ever perpetrated. Okay, according to Britannica Encyclopedia, it says Khazar, member of a confederation of Turkic-speaking tribes that in the late 6th century CE established a major commercial empire covering the southeastern section of modern European Russia. Although the origin of the term Khazar and the early history of the Khazar people are obscure, it is fairly certain that the Khazars were originally located in the northern Caucasus region and were part of the Western Turkic Empire in Turkestan. The Khazars were in contact with the Persians in the mid-6th century, and they aided the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who reigned from 610 to 641 in his campaign against the Persians. By the beginning of the 7th century, the Khazars had become independent of the Turkic Empire to the east, but by the middle of that century, the expanding empire of the Arabs had penetrated as far northern as the northern Caucasus, and from then on until the mid-8th century, the Khazars engaged in a series of wars with the Arab Empire. The Arabs initially forced the Khazars to abandon Derbent in the year 661, but around 685, the Khazars counterattacked, penetrating southward of the Caucasus into the present-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The Khazars and Arabs fought each other directly in Armenia in the 1720s. And though victory passed repeatedly from one side to the other, the Arab counterattacks eventually compelled the Khazars to permanently withdraw north of the Caucasus. The Khazars' initial victories were important, though, since they had the effect of permanently blocking Arab expansion northward into Eastern Europe. Having been compelled to shift the center of their empire northward, the Khazars, after 737, established their capital at Itil, located near the mouth of Volga River, and accepted the Caucasus Mountains as their southern boundary. During the same period, however, they expanded westward by the second half of the 8th century. Their empire had reached the peak of its power. It extended along the northern shore of the Black Sea from the lower Volga and Caspian Sea in the east to the Dnieper River in the west. The Khazars controlled and exacted tribute from the Alani and other northern Caucasian peoples dwelling between the mountains and the Kuban River, from the Magyars or Hungarians inhabiting the area around the Donets River and the Gulfs, and from the Greek colonies on the Sirmian Peninsula, the Volga, Bulgars, and various Slavic tribes also recognize the Khazars as their overlords. Although basically Turkic, the Khazar state bore little resemblance to the other Turkic empires in Central Eurasia. It was headed by a secluded supreme ruler of the semi-religious character called a Khagan, who wielded little real power, and by tribal chieftains, each known as a Beg. The state military organization also seems to have lacked the forcefulness of those of greater Turkic Mongol empires. The Khazars seem to have been more inclined to a sedentary way of life, building towns and fortresses, tilling the soil, planting gardens and vineyards. Trade and the collection of tribute were major sources of income. Textual witnesses dating from the 9th and the 10th century claims the Khazars adopted Judaism in the 8th century. These texts are not without problems, however, the lack of archaeological or other physical evidence indicates a mass conversion has called both the extent and historicity of this conversion into doubt. The prominence of influence of Khazar state were reflected in its close relations with the Byzantine emperors. Justinian II in the year 704, Constantine the fifth, I believe, it says each had a Khazar wife. The main source of revenue for the emperor stemmed from commerce, and particularly the Khazar control of the east-west trade route and linked the Far East with Byzantium, and the north-south route of linking the Arab Empire with the northern Slavic lands. Okay, now the other book that was talking about the Jewish people, it was published in the 70s. But this book right here is published on August 4th, 2020. And it says a historical tour de force that demolishes the myths and taboos that have surrounded Jewish and Israelite history. The invention of the Jewish people offers a new account of both that demands to be read and reckoned with. Was there really a forced exile in the first century at the hands of the Romans? Should we regard the Jewish people throughout 2 millennia as both a distinct ethnic group and a punitive nation returned at last to its biblical homeland? Shlomo Sand argues that most Jews actually descend from converts whose native lands were scattered far across the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The formation of a Jewish people and then a Jewish nation out of these dispatriate groups can only take place under the sway of a new historiography developing the response in the rise of nationalism throughout Europe. Beneath the biblical backfill of the 19th century historians and the 20th century intellectuals who replaced rabbis as the architects of Jewish identity, the invention of the Jewish people uncovers a new narrative of Israel and the formation and proposes a bold analysis of nationalism that accounts for old myths. After a long stay on Israel, the bestseller list, and winning the coveted award in France, The Invention of the Jewish People, finally available in English, the central importance of the conflict in the Middle East ensures the arguments will reverberate well beyond the historians and politicians that he takes to task without an adequate understanding of Israel, capable of superseding today opposing views. Diplomatic solutions are likely to remain elusive. In this iconoclastic work of history, Shlomo Sam provides the intellectual foundations of a new vision of Israel, or a humble attempt to discover the long-lost 10 tribes of Israel, preparatory of their return to their beloved city, Jerusalem. It says, D. Fenton, S. Hutchison, J. Dunham. It was produced in the year 1816. It says, Boudinot's attempt to prove that the North American Indians were descended from the Jews includes information on Indian language and customs. Boudinot, a prominent figure in Congress during the Revolution, was convinced that American Indians were the lost tribes. He was one of the 19th revivers of the theory. So a theory, as we know, is not a fact. It's just an idea. It's a guess. It says this book became one of the foremost texts for advocates of the idea. Elias Boudinot. Elias Boudinot, born May 2nd, 1740, died on the 24th day of October, 1821, was the president of the Continental Congress from November 4th, 1782 to the 2nd of November, 1783, succeeding John Hanson and preceding Thomas Mifflin. It says Elias Boudinot was born on the 2nd of May, 1740 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the son of a merchant and silversmith of Huguenot descent, and a mother born in the West Indies of Welsh descent. Boudinot was an apprentice to Richard Stockton, going to Princeton and being admitted to the bar in 1760. In 1775, Boudinot was elected to the New Jersey Provincial Assembly and promoted enlistment during the American Revolutionary War. And from May 5th, 1777 to July 1778, he served as a Commissionary General for prisoners at George Washington's request. Politics. In November 1777, he was elected as a delegate from New Jersey to the Continental Congress, and in November 1782, he was elected to be president of the Continental Congress for a one-year term. In this post, he was the first head of state of the United States after independence, and his tenure as president saw the United States build up its infrastructure and begin to form its present-day government. The Continental Congress was disbanded and replaced with the U.S. Army, and several towns and cities were built up to accommodate the needs of the growing population. Boudinot will be responsible for the early development of the 13 states until he left office in November of 1783. Boudinot would later serve in the U.S. House of Representatives as a representative from New Jersey, and he died 1821. If you like this presentation, please drop me a like. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and please hit the notification bell if you would like to know when I drop a new video. Thanks.